Well, great question. And I think one that speaks to the exhibition and to the project that we're talking about a lot. Um, the answer, I think, is yes and no. Modernism meant something very different in different parts of the world. In Europe, I think it meant something different than it meant in North America or Asia or Australia or South America. As I understand it, one of the main precepts of modernism was shedding the weight of European history, which naturally is heavier in Europe than anywhere else. So to talk about a global modernism is simplifying that a lot, because all of these different things, all these different places would deal with it slightly differently. That said, there is sort of this movement that happened in the early 20th to mid 20th century that affected the entire world, in some places more than others. And so we can look at that as sort of a network of modernisms as opposed to just a singular modernism. But Monica, what do you think?
Well, what I think is that modernism is a very multi-layered concept, and it is like a roof, this modernism, and under this roof there are so very different modernism. We have the classical modernism, we have the moderate modernism, we have tropical modernism, we have modernism with a social focus, and so on. And so I think it is important that maybe this international modernism is an idea that was international in a way, because it is about traveling, it is about motion, it is about communication. And maybe these subjects are global at a time, but the way this modernism is formed, it is by local conditions, by the special social conditions and climate conditions and so on. So maybe an international idea, but formed by local conditions.
Yeah, I think the big roof of modernism that you started with, I think, is very accurate. So maybe there's a big roof with a network underneath it. I think the cultural significance of objects is really the heart of the matter when we're talking about the production and contemplation of an artwork, or art objects in general. How that overlays with the process of social transformation becomes more complicated, of course. But I think that is really what the project that I made with Monica's consultation is really looking at. I read a book a few years ago called Objectivity, which was written by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. And it rests on this interesting balancing of the words objectivity and subjectivity, and it builds on the idea that those two words changed meaning in history. Once upon a time, they meant the opposite of what they were. And it wasn't until Immanuel Kant started to really use them that we settled into the idea that the objective is something that's out in the world and true, and the subjective is something that we perceive. And that social transformation of an object, I think something similar is happening, that there's this slipperiness between what was true 100 years ago and what is true now. And so these objects that we're so invested in, the Torfolium and these other objects that we've been looking at, that meant something. When Gropius chose these materials long ago, he was thinking about something different than we are thinking about now. And we're sort of trying to look back at that. And through that, we're seeing the social transformation and this sort of slipperiness of history. And that slipperiness, I keep using that word, is what's so interesting about it. I think that if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Yes, I think in a very similar direction than what you were saying. So at first, I also think it is a main focus of my work. At first concerning the Bauhaus buildings, because they are monuments, listed monuments, and parts of the World Heritage Site because of their cultural significance. And also in some aspects of social transformation. So, for example, the Turton settlement, it was planned like an experimental settlement to find out cheap housing and to find out the best type for cheap housing to make a standard for the future. So it is in these buildings that they try to make social transformation, and that is their cultural significance. Or another example is the masters' houses. They are something with an idea of a construction kit at a large scale. And this is also trying to make serial buildings, to make cheaper buildings, and at the same time to make individual buildings. So again, this is the cultural, one aspect of the cultural significance, and it is about social transformation. And what Fritz mentioned, the objects in our exhibition, they tell stories. And the story is, as you mentioned, Fritz, was I thinking about the valuation, and the valuation that is changing. If I take an example and look at steel window, maybe again Turton settlement, then I see it has been a very modern and fine object in those days. And then the following decades, it was old-fashioned and nobody wanted it, and sometimes thrown away, coming right into the archive. And nowadays it is again modern thing. So we see the valuation of these elements is changing, and it is so worthy as we say that it is. We means the society.
Yeah, I think we're in a moment now where a lot of things at the Bauhaus and periods around that, and we see this a lot at the Albers Foundation also, that ideas that were very, very avant-garde and new 100 years ago or 90 years ago, then became, well, harder to understand across the middle of the century. And now they seem so relevant, and it's like they've just jumped over 100 years and are modern again. But of course, they're not identical to what they were 100 years ago because the world is very different.
Yes, of course. I think it is very necessary because the questions of our world today, they are global. Just thinking about climate change, thinking about digital world and so on, these are global questions. And so I think it is not possible to find answers only with Western knowledge. So it is completely necessary to bring non-Western knowledge together with Western knowledge. And for my personal work, it is always an inspiration to see how other cultures work with, for example, with the preservation of buildings. And maybe one example, in Japan, there is this Ise-Shrine, and it is fascinating because they do not keep this shrine and preserve it. But what they do is that they every 20 years demolish it and rebuild it completely, exactly with the same material, exactly with the same working skills and so on. So I do not want to do this with the Bauhaus building. Do not understand me wrong, but it is very inspiring to see that the way to think about preservation of buildings or of ideas could be so different. So it is so necessary that non-Western and Western knowledge comes together.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that the example from Japan is wonderful. And I think also that architecture and design are maybe a very good place for this conversation to be happening. We're a very visual culture, and architecture and design are very much about what is visual. So we can make it very clear through architecture and design implementation, but also education, what's important to us. And if it's important to us that we address climate change, and we address social inequity and all these other things, all the problems that have developed well over centuries, we can do that visually through good design and through good architecture.
Fritz, may I ask a question to you?
Yeah, please.
I do not know Anni Albers as good as you know, but isn't it that Anni Albers was gets inspiration from the native Indian culture in America? So isn't it an example for that Western knowledge from the Bauhaus came together with this Indian culture?
Yeah, absolutely. Both Joseph and Anni Albers took much inspiration from their travels in Mexico and further south. And we can see it in both of their artworks. There's a pillow behind me I can see that has an Anni Albers pattern on it. She did not make that pillow, but it is inspired by her. And these patterns that she focused on the these repeated triangle patterns for about 20 years or maybe more. And she never said specifically that this is coming from Native American culture or any other place, but very clearly she had seen these patterns in lots of places, not only Native American culture, but elsewhere. And she embraced that these ideas come from all over the place. And coming back to this idea of the network, she was pulling ideas from everywhere. We're all pulling ideas from everywhere. And I think that this moment when we have access to so much through the internet and through travel and all that's available now, I think we can make use of that in productive and helpful ways, and we should be.